Have you ever set out on a peaceful hiking adventure only for something to feel off? Maybe you're walking along a quiet trail, breathing in the fresh mountain air, when suddenly the world around you seems to change. The birds stop singing. The wind picks up unnaturally. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Something lurks in the shadows of the trees. In this video, I will share 3 disturbing true hiking horror stories that will make you rethink your next outdoor adventure, from eerie disappearances to encounters with unexplainable forces. These stories are not for the faint of heart. So, buckle up, because these hiking trips took terrifying twists that no one saw coming. It was the kind of day that made you feel alive. The sky was a brilliant blue with not a cloud in sight, and the sun was beaming down, warming the cool mountain air. The kind of weather that makes you want to get out into the woods and soak in the peace of nature. That's exactly what I did that morning. I set out on a familiar trail in the Appalachian Mountains, a trail I had hiked countless times before. Each time I hiked it, the sense of tranquility I felt was like a balm for my soul. The towering trees whispered in the wind, and the smell of pine and damp earth was comforting. The trail was my sanctuary. I've always been someone who enjoys hiking alone. There's something about being by yourself in the wilderness, free from distractions, that clears your mind. I had done it many times, and I knew the trail well. It was a trail that was relatively easy to navigate, but it did have its share of tight corners and thick forest. That's why, when I entered a particularly dense patch of woods, I wasn't surprised to see someone ahead of me. He looked about my age with a bright red jacket that stood out against the green backdrop of the forest. I called out a casual greeting to him, as I usually do when I pass someone on the trail. "Hey, how's it going?" I expected the usual nod or a short reply, but there was nothing. No response, not even a glance. The silence that followed felt strangely heavy, almost as if the forest had swallowed up his voice. I continued walking, approaching him cautiously. As I got closer, I realized something wasn't right. He was standing there, but there was something unnerving about his stillness. His body was rigid, like he was frozen in place. His backpack, half open, lay on the ground next to him, with his water bottle and a map carelessly spilled out. I stopped a few feet away from him, wondering why he hadn't moved or spoken. When I got within arm's reach, I could see more details that made my heart race. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't looking at anything in particular. They were fixed on the sky, unblinking, almost vacant. His skin was cold, too cold for someone who had been hiking just moments before. The kind of cold you feel when you touch someone who's been still for too long. I shook his shoulder, expecting him to stir, maybe give me a startled look and tell me he was just taking a break. But he didn't move, no response, not even a flinch. I crouched down next to him, feeling an overwhelming sense of unease creeping over me. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no obvious injuries. His clothes were undisturbed, his gear scattered around him as if he had just sat down for a rest. But his body, it felt lifeless. His face held no expression and his posture was unnatural. It was as if he had just dropped where he stood, never to rise again. It didn't make sense. Panic gripped me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help. My fingers shook as I unlocked the screen, but when I checked for service, I was met with the dreaded "no signal" message. I looked around desperately, hoping to spot someone else on the trail. Maybe there was another hiker nearby who had seen something, or maybe someone could help. But the woods around me were eerily still. No other hikers, no footsteps, no voices in the distance. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed up the sounds of life. I stood there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. The quiet was deafening. The usual rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the sounds that always accompanied a hike were missing. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. Something felt terribly off. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave him there, but I couldn't help him either. I had no way of contacting anyone, and the thought of just standing there in the silence felt suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I made the decision to leave. I ran back down the trail, my legs moving faster than they ever had before, not daring to look behind me. The weight of that silence, that feeling of something wrong, pressed down on me with every step. When I finally made it back to the main trail, I was out of breath and trembling. I pulled out my phone again, praying for a signal. This time it worked. I quickly dialed 911 and explained what I had seen, but by the time the rescue team arrived, the body was gone. The area where I had found him was completely empty. There was no sign of the hiker, no trace of his gear, not even a footprint on the ground. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Later, when I spoke with the authorities, they informed me that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The Appalachian Mountains had a long history of hikers disappearing without a trace. Some were found days or even weeks later, but many were never found at all. Some of them had been experienced hikers, familiar with the trails, but they just vanished, leaving behind no evidence of what had happened to them. It was a mystery that baffled both hikers and authorities alike. The more I learned, the more I realized that the area was notorious for strange disappearances. People who had ventured off the trail and simply never returned. Despite extensive searches, no one had ever been able to explain what happened to them. Was it the wilderness itself? Something hidden deep in the forest, something that made people disappear without a trace? Or was it something darker? Something more sinister? No one could say for sure. But that day, when I stood over the lifeless body of the hiker in the red jacket, I couldn't shake the terrifying question that haunted me. What happens to the people who vanish in the wild? As I left the Appalachian Mountains that day, I couldn't help but feel a deep unease that stayed with me long after I had returned home. The forest had swallowed someone whole, and I had seen it happen with my own eyes. The mystery of the vanishing hikers would remain with me, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the wilderness. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. My friends and I had been planning it for months, a hiking trip through a quiet, remote section of the Colorado Rockies. We were looking forward to the fresh mountain air, the peacefulness of the wilderness, and spending some time away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The thought of being surrounded by nothing but towering trees, clear skies, and the sounds of nature made us excited. But as it often happens in stories like this, things didn't go as planned. We arrived at our campsite late in the afternoon. It was secluded, just the way we wanted it. No other campers for miles. A local hiker had recommended the spot, telling us it was peaceful and perfect for a quiet night under the stars. We were thrilled. The campsite was nestled between two large rock formations with a small clearing in the center. A perfect place to set up our tents and build a campfire. The setting was almost too perfect. The trees surrounded us like silent guardians, standing tall in the fading light. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, we gathered around the fire. The warmth from the flames flickered in the air, and the smell of burning wood filled our senses. We joked and laughed, sharing stories, unaware that the night was about to take a frightening turn. One by one, my friends started to fall asleep, exhausted from the long hike. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire and staring into the dancing flames. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. The forest around us was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the firewood. Then, around midnight, something broke the silence. I heard it clearly. Two distinct sounds, a twig snapping, then another. It was coming from the edge of the forest, just beyond the light of our campfire. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was probably just a deer or some small animal moving through the woods. The animals here were used to hikers, and it wasn't unusual to hear rustling at night, but as the sounds grew louder, my sense of unease began to creep in. I stood up slowly, holding my breath, straining my eyes to see what was making the noise. The night was so dark that it felt like the forest had swallowed up everything around us. The air was still, and the only thing I could hear now was the soft, steady thumping of my own heart in my chest. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps, as if someone or something was walking towards our camp. It was too heavy to be a deer. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, pointing the beam toward the sound. For just a moment, the light caught something moving in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. I saw a figure. It was tall, much taller than any of us, and it was hunched over in a way that didn't seem right. It didn't walk normally. It shuffled, dragging its feet across the ground as if it couldn't quite move properly. And then, in an instant, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I was frozen for a second, my mind trying to make sense of what I had just seen. What was that? My body seemed to move before I could fully think. I ran to the tent, heart racing. I shook my friends awake, panic flooding my voice as I told them what I had seen. At first, they didn't believe me, thinking I might have been imagining things. But when we went outside to investigate, everything was silent. Too silent. The forest around us was still, as if nothing had ever happened. There were no signs of the figure, no footprints in the soft dirt, no broken branches, no indication that anything had been there. Just the eerie quiet of the woods at night. I shone the flashlight in every direction, hoping to catch another glimpse, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no shadow lurking in the trees. Just the empty darkness. My friends were starting to get uneasy too. We knew we couldn't stay there anymore. We packed up quickly, our nerves on edge, and decided to leave in the middle of the night. The thought of staying another minute in that spot made my skin crawl. As we hurried down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustling of the trees seemed like it was something following us, just out of sight. The whole experience felt wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We didn't talk much on the hike back to the car, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When we returned to town, we met some locals at a small diner who seemed to know exactly what we were talking about when we mentioned the strange figure in the woods. They told us there were stories of figures like the one I had seen, tall, shadowy figures that appeared in the darkness. Some people believed it was the spirit of a hiker who had gone missing years ago. Others whispered about a strange creature that roams the Rocky Mountains, one that nobody really understands. But no one knew for sure. All we knew was that we had seen something that didn't belong in the woods. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't think I ever will. But the feeling of being watched, of having something lurking in the shadows, is something I'll never forget. It was as if the forest was hiding something from us, something that only appears when the night is at its darkest. Whatever it was, I never want to see it again. One of the scariest experiences I've ever had took place during a solo hiking trip in the Pacific Northwest. It was a trail that people often talked about in hushed tones, and for good reason. The trail was known for its stunning beauty, but it also had a dark reputation. Word on the street was that anyone who hiked it alone would face strange, unexplainable things. I didn't believe it at first. I figured it was just talk. But what happened to me that day proved just how real those stories were. I started my hike early in the morning. The air was chilly and thick fog hung low over the forest, wrapping everything in a blanket of mystery. The path was narrow, winding through towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. My boots crunched on the wet leaves as I made my way deeper into the woods. It felt peaceful at first, The only sound was the rhythm of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as I moved further into the forest, something began to feel off. It wasn't a loud feeling, but more like a subtle pressure, as if something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint whispers in the wind, like distant voices calling out from the trees. I turned around each time, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just the same dense fog and empty path. It was strange, but I convinced myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I had to push forward. There was no turning back. About halfway through the hike, I came across something unexpected. An old, weather-beaten cabin. It wasn't on the map, and it looked abandoned. But it caught my curiosity. The windows were shattered, and the door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. Without really thinking, I approached the cabin. As I got closer, I noticed strange symbols carved into the wooden door. They didn't look like anything I recognized, and something about them made my skin crawl. But I didn't turn back. My curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air in the cabin was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood filled my nose. Every step I took caused the wooden floorboards to groan under my weight. I moved slowly, my eyes scanning the room for anything that might tell me more about the cabin's history. As I walked further into the dark interior, I saw something on a small table in the corner, a leather-bound journal. It looked old, like it had been there for decades, untouched by time. I picked it up and began flipping through the pages. The journal was filled with strange and disturbing entries. At first, the writing seemed normal, but then it took a darker turn. The entries described a hiker who had gone missing in the area many years ago. The hiker wrote about hearing voices in the trees, seeing dark figures moving in the shadows, and feeling a constant, growing sense of fear. The words were haunting, and as I read, I couldn't shake the feeling that what the hiker had experienced mirrored everything I was feeling on the trail. The last entry was the most chilling of all. If you find this journal, leave the trail. Don't look back. The curse follows. A cold chill ran through my body. My heart began to race. I could feel the weight of the words pressing down on me. This wasn't just some creepy old journal. It felt like a warning. I had to get out of there. I dropped the journal back on the table and bolted toward the door. But as I stepped outside, something was different. The air felt heavier. The whispers I had heard earlier seemed louder now, like they were closing in on me from all sides. The forest that had once felt peaceful now seemed dark and hostile. The trees loomed over me, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long, twisted shadows across the trail. I turned to leave, but it felt like the path itself was changing, as if the forest was trying to trap me. My heart was pounding in my chest. Panic set in. I started running, not even caring about the trail or where it was leading. I just had to get away. The sound of my own breath and pounding footsteps filled my ears as I ran as fast as I could, but it felt like the forest was closing in on me, pushing me back with every step. I didn't dare to look behind me. I knew something was following just out of sight, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. When I finally reached the parking lot and saw my car in the distance, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The fog seemed to lift, and the sounds of the forest faded away. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, like I had escaped something dangerous. But as I sat in my car, ready to drive away, that feeling of being followed didn't go away. It lingered. Even though I was safe, I still felt like someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows of the woods. I never went back to that trail. Every time I think about it, I remember that feeling of being hunted, of something lurking just out of sight. Maybe it was the curse the journal warned about. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I don't think I'll ever know. And honestly, I don't want to find out. So, what do you think? These stories are chilling reminders that sometimes nature isn't as peaceful as it seems. Hiking is meant to be an escape, but as you've seen, it can also be a gateway to terrifying, unexplained experiences. What would you do if you found yourself in one of these situations? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Stay safe out there, hikers. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees.